In the past, men and women were imprisoned and sold as commodities, a time when freedom was a luxury enjoyed only by a few. People without freedom, if they were lucky, would end up as servants in the house of noble families. Others had to do the hard work in plantations or work in mines and quarries, but some were forced to take up arms to defend their lives. These brave fighters were known as gladiators. The gladiators were slaves. The vast majority were warriors captured on the battlefields. These warriors were proud men with a strong character. This made many difficult to control. They were a risk to the families who bought them. But not all of them were trained warriors. There were also various kinds of criminals, and these even included indebted people who failed to pay what they owed. Many slave buyers avoided this sort of problem. The solution was to give another purpose to these unfortunate people, and the fighting began in the arenas. The fight between gladiators began very early in Roman history and was already present in previous cultures. It was a funeral event to mark the death of someone important. The first battles were organized in simple wooden arenas. Usually, the fight was unarmed, very similar to the boxing of today. However, this quickly bored the spectators. Weapons began to be used in the arena, creating much more savage and cruel results. The name gladiator comes from the gladius, a typical Roman sword, used mainly by legionnaires in military campaigns. The gladius was a short, heavy sword, designed to be used in stabbing motions. It could cause great damage when used in a sharp blow. As time went by, the gladiators began to use various weapons, creating greater diversity in the fighting. Men known as lannistas were responsible for buying the gladiators, feeding them, and providing them space for training. They created academies known as ludus gladiatoris. To increase their chances in the arena, the gladiators were required to undergo rigorous daily training, which consisted of weightlifting, running, and of course, weapons training. The diet was essentially vegetarian. Meat was consumed only once or twice a week. This food was expensive and inaccessible to a large part of the population. To compensate, the gladiators consumed a lot of carbohydrates and calcium. They even drank bone powder mixed with water to strengthen their own bone structure. They were undoubtedly strong men, but they did not have the appearance of athletes with a definite musculature. Most of them accumulated fat to increase their chances of surviving the cutting of their weapon. Gladiators were allowed to train only with wooden weapons. They were only allowed to use deadly weapons before entering the arena. Their armor was basically ornamental. It exposed the most important parts of the body. The training was guided by an experienced gladiator who was skilled enough to have guaranteed his retirement or buy his own freedom. He was given the position of doctore. He was responsible for supervising all training, teaching fighting techniques, and applying punishment. The gladiators were divided into different categories according to the equipment they used. Among them was the murmillo, which used a large fish-shaped helmet similar. As a weapon, he used a short sword and a regular shield. There was also the retiarius, which used a fishing net accompanied by a trident. The net was used to try to trap the weapon or helmet of the opposing gladiator. The trident, in turn, was responsible for the mortal blow. The thrax was a curved sword with an exuberant helmet, with feathers and horsehair. The provocateurs often used spears, and their specialty was fighting against animals. These categories also determined the types of combat for which gladiator would be fit. The fights were organized for the gladiators to fight in duels, battles between opposing groups, or each for himself. There were few rules during the fights. The duel between high-level gladiators was accompanied by 1 or 2 judges in the arena. The fights rarely lasted more than 10 or 15 minutes, and the gladiators were instructed to perform well, even if it cost them their lives. This was evident in the famous phrase, "Hail Caesar, we who are about to die salute you." At the moment of his death, the gladiator should show bravery and accept his destiny without begging for life or weeping. This was seen as a good death. Although rare, there were women gladiators, and their participation in the fighting was a special event. As if it were not enough to face another armed and trained warriors, the gladiators could have the misfortune of fighting wild animals in the arena. Tigers, lions, bulls, and even elephants were used in the dreadful fighting. To survive, it was necessary to have more than just willpower. Despite all this danger, the gladiators could buy their own freedom if they could accumulate enough money, an opportunity that other kinds of slaves rarely had. The Lannistas made high stakes for money, putting their best gladiators in the arena. If the gladiator emerged victoriously, he would receive a small share of that money. The most famous gladiators could even accumulate a fortune, and many continued to fight even after buying their freedom. Not all fights ended in death. In smaller shows, the gladiators could stop the fight at the first injury or stage a fake death. One of the ways of staging a death was to fall to the ground pretending to have been mortally wounded. Then they would pierce a small bladder containing the blood of some animal, creating the impression that the blood belonged to the gladiator. The life of the gladiator could also be spared by the figure of greater authority present in the spectacle. Normally, he was the organizer of the event, or even the Roman emperor himself. This was done with a gesture using the thumb of the right hand. When turned up, the gladiator was spared and would live to fight another day. When turned down, that dictated the end of his life on the sands of the arena. There were many arenas throughout the Roman Empire, but none compared to the Colosseum. The Colosseum was a monumental structure. It was the largest amphitheater ever built and could accommodate about 65,000 spectators. Many other types of events took place at the Colosseum, plays, and the trial of criminals. But the gladiators were the main attraction, an event eagerly awaited by the entire Roman population. It was something very similar to today's great sports championships. Tickets were sold many days in advance. They became more expensive as the day of the fights approached. At the Colosseum, impressive fights were organized. The gladiators reproduced epic battles. In some situations, the amphitheater arena was even flooded to mimic naval battles. Many gladiators became legends in the arena, being represented in paintings and sculptures of the time. The fights were the main subject of conversations in the streets of Rome. All this fame and the chance to gain wealth attracted even free men to fight in the arenas. Among these men, even a Roman emperor was carried away by the ambition to feel on his skin what it was like to be a gladiator. His name was Commodus. Despite his apparent courage, Commodus did not fight fairly. He faced only wounded animals or forced his opponent gladiator to use a wooden sword. All this popularity led many nobles in Rome to organize exhibitions and fights in order to gain fame and even divert the attention of the population from conflicts in city politics. Obviously, many gladiators were not happy to spend the rest of their lives fighting to satisfy the ambitions of rich men and the bloodthirst of the Roman population. One of these gladiators was Spartacus. In 73 BC, Spartacus, along with 70 of his training companions, managed to escape from the training center where he was prisoner. He then attacked other academies, freeing many gladiators and other slaves, forming an army of about 40,000 rebels. The rebellion ended when Spartacus's army was defeated by the Roman legions. But this episode caused a deep wound in Roman pride, and the gladiators started to be seen with reluctant respect. Gladiator fighting continued for many centuries. They were officially closed only in 536 AD, as they no longer attracted large numbers of spectators. They started to be seen as a barbaric spectacle. also due to the influence of Christianity in Europe. The history of the gladiators is glorious and tragic. They will be eternally remembered as the heroes of the arena.